Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma allimna ma yanfa'una wa zidna ilman wa amalan wa ikhlasan ya rabbil alameen. Ameen. First of all, Jazakallah khair to Dr. Zohair for encouraging me to make the long trip all the way down to Australia. It's quite a long flight from Canada, but mashallah, his persistence and encouragement really, paid off. And he's somebody that I deeply admire and have always benefited from, as Allah Subhanahu wa Taala knows. And of course, humble thanks to Soul Seed for facilitating the tour, and to all of you for coming out and attending here at Faith Circle. So Zohair has told me about, mashallah, the enthusiasm and the caliber of this group, and I'm very excited to be meeting you all and to join you all for this session. Now, Zohair talked about the virtues of dua, and I want to just connect that with what we're going to be talking about today, about the importance of critical thinking for Muslims. So, we recite Surah Al-Fatiha 17 times a day, right? Minimum 17 times a day. And in Surah Al-Fatiha, when we recite إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, we say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you alone do we worship, and from you alone do we seek help. This verse contains two pillars in the life of a believer. The first is our ibadah, our worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if that is secure, that will order our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and establish and solidify our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the essence of ibadah, as you are all learning, is the concept of dua. Ad-du'a huwa al-ibadah. The essence of ibadah is dua. So ibadah is what solidifies our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the second concept that is mentioned here is isti'ana, right? وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. From you alone do we seek help. From you alone do we seek help. See, we seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of our worldly affairs. And from the help that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us is the divine guidance, which trains our mind, which trains our aql to be able to distinguish between truth and falsehood, to be able to acquire ilm, to be able to gain knowledge. So in this verse, we have what will solidify our spiritual affairs and our worldly affairs. We have dua as a means to solidify our spiritual affairs, and we have the gift of aql and the hidayah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, which grants us success in all of our worldly affairs. Furthermore, developing our capacity to reason appropriately, developing our aql, allows us to enhance our dua, to understand what are our priorities. What should we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for? When you make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your dua can show brilliance, genius in how you phrase your dua, in the ways in which you structure your dua, because you know the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You call upon the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in connection to what you are requesting from Him. And that also shows your priorities in life. So all of that is connected to being a critical thinker as a believer. So dua is developing your capacity for critical thinking by shaping your priorities in life, by shaping your understanding of what is true and what is false. Right? One of the important du'as is Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqan warzuqna ittiba'ah. Right? Oh Allah, allow us to see the truth as true and grant us the ability to follow it. وَأَرِنَا الْبَاطِلَ بَاطِلًا, and allow us to see the falsehood as false, and grant us the capacity to abstain from it, to avoid it. So dua is connected to our ability distinguish truth from falsehood. Now, in this presentation, and this is something that's part of a series which we will continue, inshallah. I want to focus on how Islam gives us a unique concept of critical thinking, and what is the difference between the Islamic approach to the aql, the intellect, versus the predominant approach that we find in Western civilization. And a lot of the examples that I'm going to use are examples pertaining to what we see happening today, particularly with the genocide taking place in Gaza and why this is happening. So, I don't know if everyone can see the slides or if I'm blocking it. You can see it? Okay, perfect. So, just to kind of go over some basic groundwork in terms of what is critical thinking. Critical thinking as a term in the West emerged really, early on with the American philosopher John Dewey. He died 1952. He talked about critical thinking as being an active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it and further to the conclusions to which it tends. So he mentions two things here: the grounds which support it, and the corresponding concept that we would have in our tradition is adillah. Adillah is plural of dalil, right? What is the dalil? What is the evidence? What is the grounds which support this conclusion? And also, what are the consequences that arise from this? What are the lawazim? What are the consequences? So we have these two aspects in critical thinking, right? What is the evidence, and what are the consequences that follow from this particular position? That's the first thing. The second thing that is mentioned when you look at the history of critical thinking, you find that there was a heavy emphasis on critical thinking in the American education system because it was believed that critical thinking made people better citizens in a democracy, and there was this focus on problem solving as a method of critical thinking. So, the interesting thing is that John Dewey actually revised his book in 1933 and changed the term from critical thinking to reflective thinking because he felt that certain progressive schools had taken the concept of critical thinking and not really developed it appropriately. So they allowed children freedom to just question and criticize things, but they didn't really give them guidance, was the terms that he mentioned, which is interesting. But by that time, critical thinking had already become so widespread as a term that nobody really shifted to adopt reflective thinking instead. Now, one of the early articulations of critical thinking we find from the University School of Ohio State University. They describe critical thinking in these terms. They say critical thinking originates with sensing of a problem. It is a quality of thought operating in an effort to solve the problem. So you see that focus on problem solving. They also mention the success of democracy depends to a large extent on the ability of citizens to think critically about problems, and therefore it's one of the major goals of education. So according to the viewpoint that emerged in Western civilization, the importance of critical thinking was basically you have this dominant philosophy of liberalism, right? Liberalism that places at its top of its value hierarchy the belief that people should be free, right? You have the concept of freedom, and from that you have the freeing of people from shackles of tradition and religion so that they can figure out all the truths themselves, and therefore you should educate the ideal citizen to use their critical thinking. And a democracy is a society where everybody is thinking critically and is voting for whatever is the optimal solution for society, and that creates this sense of utopia. So that's basically the promise of liberalism, the promise of democracy, the promise of critical thinking as it developed in Western civilization. Now, the question that I have for you all is critical thinking and democracy a success or a failure? Failure. Raise your hands if you think it's a failure. Okay, a lot of hands. Raise your hands if you think it's a success. Maybe one, two hands. Okay. Those who say it's a failure, let's hear your reasons. What do you think went wrong with this vision? Remember, this ideal vision was we're going to get every citizen to just make their own choices, think critically, and therefore we'll create the most moral society that's always going to choose what's right. Yes. Influence of propaganda was not taken into account. So the idea is, oh well, we're a democracy, we're not a dictatorship. The dictator tells you what to do, right? The ruler in a democracy says, no, you get to decide what you want. But I'm going to control all the sources of information so that your decision is based on sources of information that I've controlled, so that what you will want is ultimately based on what I want. So in reality, it's a disguised dictatorship, right? It's saying, well, you get to decide, you have the freedom to decide, but ultimately the sources of information, when it's controlled by propaganda, you're not really making an informed choice, right? And this is what Noam Chomsky called manufactured consent. What is manufactured consent? You're telling people, no, you get to consent, but you are manufacturing their consent. You are generating their consent on the basis of the propaganda that you feed to them, right? And he talked about this, decades ago when he was analyzing newspaper headlines. Now it's all social media algorithms. The rate at which consent is being manufactured is way higher. Okay, what are other reasons that critical thinking did not lead to success in democracy? Yes. Lack of knowledge or guidance. Okay, excellent. So that goes back to that point where John Dewey himself realized that his idea behind critical thinking was not focusing enough on guidance. Children were told, you have freedom to do whatever you want, but they weren't actually giving them a source of guidance. You have to have a reference point to go back to. Okay, what else? What are other reasons for failure of critical thinking? Yes. Okay, so people may differ in their abilities. And this is a really important point because, on a particular issue, it may not be the case that it's best for the majority to decide what we actually do. Like if it's an issue where there's a few people who are actually really well informed about it, let's take, for example, the issue of Gaza, right? Should it be the case that, every Canadian or every Australian votes on the topic, or should it be the case that we really pay attention to what human rights activists, medical doctors on the ground, people who are actually there are telling us, and we actually prioritize the views and opinions of those with expertise and background knowledge, right? So what happens in a democracy is it ultimately goes down to everyone making their choice or voting, and that brings into power a particular political party. And so the political party's entire strategy is not based on informing the public about what is actually taking place or what is a reasonable choice. It's based on misinforming the public, scoring cheap pot shots and mudslinging at the opposition so that they can get into power, right? So that all is tied into the dysfunction that takes place within a democracy. What are other sources of failure? Yes. Right. Usually the people who want to be leaders are the least qualified to be leaders. Okay, interesting. What else? Minorities become marginalized, right? Another term that has been used is the majority vote ends up becoming the mob rule, right? And so the minorities get marginalized, their voices are isolated, they are dehumanized. And we see that taking place, right, with the Islamophobia as well, right? Okay, what else? Different types of bias. We'll talk about that as well in more detail, especially as part of this critical thinking course. Religious ethics is set aside. Okay, very important point. We're going to come back to that. Excellent. What else? Any other points? Too many options. This is one of the biggest problems in modern society. You go into the grocery store to get a box of cereal, and there's all these options, and you get this analysis paralysis. I don't even know what cereal I want. You end up leaving the grocery store more confused than when you went there, right? So what happens? Like people talk about this. It's called decision fatigue, right? You're presented with so many different options, you're not able to actually analyze the options carefully with due consideration and research everything properly, you're just bombarded with all these options, and then it's like, what do I even choose, right? Um, and sometimes all of the options are equally bad, right? And that's what people talk about. Well, we need to vote for the lesser of two evils, right? Both candidates are bad. Who's less bad, right? Trump versus Biden. Well, what are we going to do, right? That's what the discussion is like in America, right? So that's another aspect of it. So we can see that there's a lot of problems with how the project of critical thinking was envisioned and how it actually was applied and implemented in the West. So now we want to focus on what does Islam give us in terms of critical thinking and in terms of how we can develop that vision and implement it ourselves. So in terms of the Islamic perspective on rationality, on the aql, on the intellect, right? There are over 750 verses in the Qur'an which call upon the human being to use their intellect. There are over 750 verses in the Qur'an that would call upon the human being to use their rationality. That was something that was shown in a master's dissertation that was done at al-Qur'an University in Mecca. So the Qur'an heavily emphasizes the importance of critical thinking, of rationality. But there's a crucial difference between the Islamic conception of critical thinking and the Western conception of critical thinking. So when you look at the meaning of the word aql, which we translate as the intellect, the root meaning of the word aql is actually to tie something. Okay, so the iqal are the reins of the camel, right? And in fact, we still say iqal for people wearing the rings on their head, right? When they wear the shibaf, they put the iqal on their heads. That it's the reins of the camel. So the idea is the aql is what restrains a person from immoral or inappropriate behavior. So built into the Islamic concept of the aql is the idea that ethics and morality is part of our conception of rationality. There is a moral centering in the concept of rationality, which you don't find in Western thought. In Western thought, the history of Western thought, rationality is this kind of abstract, theoretical type of calculus a person does with their minds, and whether they're making choices about being a good person or not has absolutely nothing to do with it. And so you have this idea that you could be a really smart person, but also a really immoral person. From the Islamic perspective, that doesn't make any sense. The intellect is what allows you to pursue moral virtue. Okay, so morality is tied into it. And if you look at early works of, Islamic ethics, if you look at, there's a genre of works that are related to talking about the intellect. So, for example, Ibn Hibban al-Busti, a famous early Hadith scholar, he died 354 Hijri. He has a work called Rawdatul Uqala, right? The gardens of the intelligent. And in this book, he collects all of the narrations related to the intellect. All of the narrations related to the intellect. The first narration that he mentions in the book is a narration that talks about akhlaq and the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves good moral character and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala despises evil moral traits. The book is about intelligence or the intellect, and the first narration in it is about moral character. So throughout the book, you see that he's collecting narrations that show that the intellect has to do with being a moral person, making good moral, ethical decisions, avoiding vain speech, avoiding lying, avoiding dishonesty, being in the company of those people who make you a better person, being in the company of those people who make you more righteous, right? So that's tied in with the concept of morality. And he mentions the definition of the aql is knowledge of correct behavior and how to avoid sin or error. So we see that with the Islamic concept, rationality is tied to morality, and Islam teaches that the intellect is concerned with moral action, not mere abstract argumentation. And now take that view and look at what's happening online, right? Look at all the debates taking place about what is going on in Gaza. Look at all the arguments that are being thrown back and forth, and ask yourself, like, are people using their intellect to pursue moral action and implement moral truths? Or are they using their intellect to try to create arguments and excuses to justify things that are manifestly, blatantly immoral? So you see the sign here from one of the protests where somebody is saying, yet another Saturday spent explaining that killing children and committing genocide is wrong. Right? Something that is such a basic moral truth that is ingrained in the human fitrah. And yet we have to engage in some type of argumentation to prove that. Why is that the case? Why is it that people do not have the rational capacity to recognize the most rudimentary, basic, fundamental moral truths? Something has gone deeply wrong within Western civilization when that happens, right? Claiming to be champions of human rights and yet having this kind of unlimited support for a genocide taking place. And so one of the very interesting works that relates to this is a work by Wael Hallaq, Restating Orientalism. Wael Hallaq is a professor of Islamic studies at Columbia University in New York. And he's written some very interesting philosophical critiques of the West. And he's not a Muslim, he's a Palestinian Christian. But he says some very interesting and insightful things about the difference between Islamic civilization versus Western civilization. And he roots this in something that he calls a psychoepistemic disorder. The root cause of the problem in Western civilization goes back to certain thought structures, the ways that people are thinking and conceptualizing knowledge and the human being and morality and the purpose of life and all of these kind of things, detached from God, right? Detached from ethics, detached from morality. There's a fundamental disorder in the way that people are thinking, which is leading to what he says is it's actually at the root of the colonizations and genocides that the Western civilization has participated in. So let's, just in the interest of time, let's kind of go forward to talking about, well, I want to mention something about skepticism. So in Western civilization, when you talk about critical thinking, if you look at one of the popular videos out there, the highest ranked YouTube video about critical thinking, it's a video from some of these guys who are new atheists. And new atheism was a movement that pretty much had the fastest rise and fall of any movement in the West, right? It started off in the 2000s. You had Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Dan Dennett, writing all these books attacking religion. And what was new about it, of course, atheism is thousands of years old, right? Atheism goes back to figures like Democritus in the West, and even the Qur'an mentions Fir'aun denying the existence of the creator, right? So atheism is not a new thing. What was new about new atheism is that it was a movement in the West that specifically tried to convince everyone to abandon religion, and it failed miserably, right? So the Global Atheist Convention, which actually took place here in Australia, in 2017, they had to cancel it because of lack of interest. Nobody wanted to sign up to attend the convention. So they actually had to cancel the convention. Now, you can rarely find anyone who actually proudly identifies as a new atheist anymore. People have just dropped the label. But you have these, videos and books and material of these guys kicking around. So Lawrence Krauss, who was on the B list of the new atheists, he's in this video about critical thinking, and he says that the whole point of critical thinking is to be skeptical about everything. To be skeptical. And if we distrust things, then that's basically going to get us to the truth. So the idea that skepticism is the basis of rationality is something that is basically a distinctive feature of Western civilization. The idea that if we approach things with doubt and distrust and suspicion, we will actually be able to get at the truth and break down these, traditions that people have passed down. But of course, that whole view is illogical. That whole view is founded on some grave errors in reasoning. So the problem with trying to build your knowledge on skepticism is that skepticism has no end to it. When you start to doubt and distrust things, you can just keep on going, right? So people talk about these viewpoints in radical skepticism where somebody says, like, how do I know right now that I'm not dreaming? That I'm still in Canada and this was all a dream, right? That I came here to Australia. And tomorrow Zohair is going to say, why don't you come to Australia? Right? How do I know that this is not all an elaborate dream? How do I know I'm not plugged into a machine that's feeding my brain electrochemical stimulation to create these images and illusions? This is all an elaborate hallucination, right? And we find popular culture runs with these ideas like Inception, right? You plug people into a dream, or the Matrix, you're plugged into a machine that creates these illusions for you. Because people realize that there's no way to actually disprove this. If you really start to follow your doubts, you can just keep on going. And the other thing is that people are inconsistent with their doubts. So you have the new atheists who are apply their radical skepticism towards belief in God, but they don't apply radical skepticism towards belief in the external world, right? If you ask them, prove to me that you exist, prove to me that you're not an illusion, they'll get confused. But it's the same underlying problem. The problem is radical skepticism. Radical skepticism is good at destroying knowledge, but it doesn't build up knowledge. So there's a difference between radical skepticism and reasonable skepticism. Reasonable doubt is when you doubt something because it doesn't make sense, because it conflicts with the foundations of knowledge that you have. But if you try to doubt the foundations of knowledge, right? You doubt your purpose in life, you doubt that there's an external world, you doubt that there's a creator, you doubt all these different things, you won't be able to make sense of reality, because you need to have certain foundations in order to make sense of the world in which you live in. And there was, one thinker in the West who really tried to take skepticism to its logical conclusion. And it was a guy named Pyrrho of Elis in ancient Greece. He died 270 BC. He was, it said he accompanied Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great took him on all his expeditions. And when he went to India, he tried to talk about how great the ancient Greeks were. And the Indians really confused him and said, how do you know? How do you know this? How do you know that? And he became a radical skeptic. And so it's said that he was so skeptical that his students had to hold him and prevent him from walking off a cliff, because he said, well, how do I know it's really a cliff, right? Or they had to prevent him from walking into barking dogs, because he would be like, well, how do I know it's not a cat? How do I know there's actually something there? How do I know I'm not hallucinating? So there's actually a thought experiment you could do where you imagine what it would be like to be a Pyrrhonian skeptic, somebody who follows the example of Pyrrho, where you say, when you wake up in the morning, you say, did I really wake up, or am I just imagining it? How do I know I ever was asleep in the first place? How do I know that sleeping and being awake aren't actually the same thing? When you get out of bed, you say, how do I know this is actually a bed? How do I know I am standing? I could still be sitting or lying down for all I know. How do I know I was ever in this so-called bed to begin with? You start looking around, you say, how do I know this is even a room? How do I know it's my room? How do I know I'm actually doing the action called looking? There's no end to it. You could keep on going. You could see why there would be no meaningful way to live your life if you took skepticism to its ultimate conclusion. So what's the Qur'anic alternative to skepticism? And what does Islam provide us as the basis of critical thinking? So if you look at what the Qur'an mentions about the gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Rahman, of the first things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ar-Rahman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ar-Rahmanu allama al-Qur'ana خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانَ عَلَّمَهُ الْبَيَانِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the most merciful, the one who taught the Qur'an, he created the human being and taught him al-bayan. Al-bayan is the gift of knowledge, but it's specifically the gift of being able to clarify and elaborate meaning. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the human being the gift of being able to articulate meaning and understand and comprehend meaning. And that is the gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Adam alayhi salam when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught Adam alayhi salam the names of all things. This is our origin story, right? As human beings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Adam alayhi salam the ability to understand and articulate meaning. So thinking involves a conceptual language. It involves the tools that allow us to grasp and construct meaning and to connect meaning together to arrive at deeper levels of understanding, to arrive at higher levels of insight, to arrive at knowledge that brings us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and allows us to fulfill our role on this earth as custodians appointed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be His Khalifa on this earth. Thinking is the capacity to pursue that goal of articulating and elaborating meaning. And wisdom, hikmah, in the Qur'anic sense involves immersion in that source, the sources of guidance that will allow us to connect to that level of meaning and understanding. So rather than coming from a starting point where we say that knowledge begins by just distrusting and doubting everything, you come from a starting point of saying knowledge begins with seeking guidance. And you see this in developmental psychology. A baby learns, a child learns from their parents. They don't learn by doubting and questioning everything. They learn by actually trying to understand, by seeking guidance, by seeking to make meaning. Similarly, when you're learning a new language, if you're learning a new language and somebody tells you, well, this is how you say something in this language, and you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. Why is it this grammatical rule and not that one? And why is it this and why? You won't learn the language. In order to learn, you start by seeking guidance. And you have to build yourself up to acquire the conceptual tools to then be able to understand what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. But if you start by doubting at the beginning, you're not going anywhere. And so we get the Qur'anic epistemology of hidayah. Basically, the Qur'anic system of seeking guidance. The focus is not on doubt, but on truth, on how to pursue truth, how to interpret reality in a meaningful way. And if you look at the Qur'anic vocabulary, you see that there's an interesting distinction between different terms that the Qur'an uses. So in the Qur'an, we have many different terms that are related to knowledge. We have the term ilm, of course, which is the most obvious term related to knowledge, but you also have the word hidayah, or guidance. You have the word khabar, or information. You have the word hikmah, wisdom. You have the word fahm, or understanding. So you have all of this terminology in the Qur'an. If you look at how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses it, you see that there is a hierarchy, that these terms kind of chart out a path that allow you to navigate your intellectual journey, your journey of critical thinking. So hidayah, guidance, is at the peak. But what happens is you start with khabar, you start with information. And in the West, the understanding of knowledge is basically just reduced to information. But in our understanding, that's the lowest level of understanding, is just having raw data, right? Raw data could be totally meaningless. If I tell you, find me the average size of the middle toe of everyone whose name starts with the letter P. That's a lot of data, but it's completely meaningless. It lends no insight into the world or into guidance of how to live your life or how to become a morally upright person. But the West is obsessed with data. But khabar needs to be combined with fahm, understanding, to reach a level of ilm, of knowledge. And then it has to be connected with the application of that knowledge, the connection between ilm and amal, in order to reach the level of hikmah, of wisdom. And then it has to be connected with your ultimate goal and destination in life in order to reach the level of hidayah, of guidance. So all of these things are connected together. When knowledge transforms your life by impacting your sense of direction and destination, that is hidayah. So having discussed these different aspects, you can start to see how Islam provides us with something very different to what is the dominant system of thought in modern society today. Islam gives us a conception of critical thinking that is linked to our worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, linked to our ethical duties towards other human beings, linked to our moral virtue, and provides us with a clear picture and a path of where we need to go as human beings. It provides us with a direction for society, rather than the dominant ideology of liberalism, which says, our ultimate goal for society is people should be free to do whatever they want, right? That's the ultimate goal. There's no sense of direction for where we as a society should go in terms of developing ourselves morally and spiritually. So this is where the Islamic outlook provides us with a very unique vision. And that's where I wanted to leave off for today, inshallah ta'ala. So we could take any questions if there are any questions related to this topic. And we're going to go into further detail next week on the methods of reasoning, methods of critical thinking according to the Islamic perspective, inshallah ta'ala.